Casey Marlowe is a broke, blunt, and perpetually underdressed 27-year-old graphic designer who agrees to a blind date set up by her well-meaning but catastrophically misguided best friend. Purely for the free steak. She expects a boring accountant. She gets Luca Vitale, ruthless mafia boss, feared across 3 continents, and the owner of a wardrobe so aggressively expensive it has its own bodyguard. Within the first 10 minutes, Casey tells him his suit looks like a chandelier had a fight with a funeral. Welcome to Flustered novel, where love is chaotic, confessions are awkward, and every story comes with butterflies, drama, and a little emotional damage. Grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's dive into today's romance story. Let me set the scene. It was a Tuesday, already suspicious because nothing good has ever happened to me on a Tuesday. And I was sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor, eating cereal for dinner, and watching a documentary about competitive dog grooming, when my phone rang. Sophie. I should have let it go to voicemail. I know that now. In hindsight, it is perhaps the most obvious thing I have ever failed to do. Ranking just above don't open that email at 2 a.m. And maybe don't tell your boss his presentation font gives you a headache. But I answered, because Sophie had this particular ringtone assigned to her. The Jaws theme. And like all great horror movie protagonists, I walked directly toward the music. Casey, she said, in the voice she uses when she's already decided something and is simply notifying me. I've found you a man. Sophie, I have cereal. That's not a man, that's a coping mechanism. I looked down at my bowl. She wasn't wrong, but that felt irrelevant. I don't want a blind date, I told her very clearly with great conviction. Like someone who absolutely ends up going on the blind date. He's tall, she said. No. Dark. No. Rich. Define rich. Casey. He has a driver. I considered this. I hadn't had a car since my 2009 Honda Civic decided, last March, that it was simply done. Done with roads. Done with me. Done with existing. I'd been taking the bus ever since, and the bus stop near my apartment smelled aggressively of old ambition and someone's abandoned gym bag. A man with a driver felt like a fairy tale. What's the catch? I asked. There's no catch. He's just private. And serious. And his friends call him. Okay, they don't really call him anything because they seem slightly afraid of him, but I'm sure that's just a personality thing. Sophie. The restaurant has wagyu beef, Casey. Wagyu. And that was it. That was how I ended up agreeing to have dinner with a man I'd never met, at a restaurant I definitely couldn't afford, on a Tuesday, wearing the nicest dress I owned. Which is to say, a green wrap dress I'd bought on sale in 2021 that had a small paint stain on the hem, I was hoping candlelight would hide. For the steak. I did it for the steak. I did not know, as I touched up my mascara in the bathroom mirror and practiced my, I am a normal, charming adult woman face, that the man waiting for me at table 12 had once made a senator cry with a single phone call. I did not know that his name was Luca Vitale, that he ran the most sophisticated criminal organization on the Eastern Seaboard, or that every person in that restaurant, the waitstaff, the sommelier, the man pretending to read a menu near the window, was either on his payroll or terrified of him. I did not know any of that. What I did know, the moment I walked up to that table and got a good look at him, was that whoever had sold this man that suit had genuinely done him dirty. And because I am, at my core, someone with absolutely no volume control between my brain and my mouth, I said so. The maitre d' led me to the table with the energy of a man walking someone toward a cliff, and I remember thinking that's a little dramatic before I looked up and saw him. Luca Vitale was, fine, I'll admit it, objectively attractive. Tall, which Sophie had promised. Dark also delivered. Shoulders that seemed to have their own separate architectural plans. A jaw so sharp I briefly wondered if he filed it. He was perhaps 34, 35, with dark eyes that were doing that thing eyes do in romance novels where they seem to assess you. And not in a flattering way, more in a I am calculating the structural weaknesses of this situation way. He stood when I approached, which was unexpectedly gentlemanly, and extended a hand. Ms. Marlowe. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man who had never once been in a rush because the world arranged itself around his schedule. I've Luca. Casey, I said and shook his hand, and then I made the mistake of letting my eyes drift to his suit. It was, look, I need you to understand. I'm a graphic designer. I see color combinations for a living. I have opinions about visual harmony the way other people have opinions about football. And what this man was wearing was a 3-piece suit in a shade that could only be described as aggressive gold. Not a tasteful champagne, not a warm bronze, but gold, with a subtle paisley pattern that seemed to breathe under the restaurant lighting, paired with a pocket square in peacock blue and a tie that had, I want to be very precise here, tiny embroidered crests on it. It was, individually, the most expensive ugly thing I had ever seen. I looked back up at his face. He was watching me with the focused patience of someone who was accustomed to people reacting to him, presumably with fear or flattery. "Nice to meet you," I said. "Is your suit supposed to look like that?" Silence. Not regular silence. The specific silence of an entire restaurant collectively forgetting to breathe. Luca Vitale's expression did not change. Not 1 millimeter. He looked at me the way a particularly confident cat looks at something it has not yet decided whether to be interested in. "I beg your pardon," he said. "The suit," I said, pulling out my chair because apparently I was going to continue this. "It's giving very much chandelier had a fight with a funeral. Did someone recommend it to you? Or was this a personal choice? Because either way, I feel like there needs to be a conversation." The man standing just behind Luca's left shoulder, large, expressionless, with the posture of someone professionally trained to be menacing, made a sound that might have been a very suppressed laugh, or a very suppressed gasp, and I genuinely couldn't tell which. Luca Vitale sat back down very slowly. "No one," he said, after a pause that lasted approximately 1 geological era, "has ever said that to me." "About the suit? About anything?" I picked up my menu. "Well," I said cheerfully, "there's a first time for everything. Do you know if the wagyu is good here? That's basically why I came." Another silence. And then, quietly, barely perceptibly, like a fault line shifting, something in his expression moved. Not quite a smile. More like the concept of a smile, floating somewhere behind his eyes, deciding whether or not to materialize. "It's excellent," he said. "Wonderful," I said. "I'm going to need it to survive this suit." The man behind his shoulder definitely laughed that time. He turned it into a cough. It did not work. By the time the appetizers arrived, I had criticized his pocket square, "Looks like a tropical bird surrendered." Complimented his watch, "Okay, that I like, whoever sold you that watch should be selling you everything else." And asked if he actually enjoyed being described as intense, or if it just kept happening to him. He had remarkably answered all of these. Briefly. Precisely. With the air of someone taking careful notes. It wasn't until I excused myself to the restroom, pulled out my phone and typed Luca Vitale, New York into the search bar, purely because Sophie had said his friends seemed afraid of him and my curiosity had finally caught up with my mouth, that I realized why the restaurant staff had been refilling my water glass approximately every 90 seconds. Vitale family patriarch expands influence across Eastern Seaboard. Luca Vitale. The name Wall Street and Washington won't say out loud. FBI investigation into Vitale Enterprises stalls for 3rd consecutive year. I sat in the very elegant restaurant bathroom and stared at my phone for a very long time. Then I looked at myself in the mirror. I told my reflection. Told a mob boss his suit was ugly. My reflection had no comfort to offer. I considered, genuinely, climbing out the bathroom window. I assessed the window. It was decorative. It did not open. I considered faking a medical emergency. I dismissed this because the man probably had a doctor on staff, and I would end up receiving excellent, deeply inconvenient care. I considered just going back to the table, because I had already said everything I was going to say, and also the wagyu hadn't arrived yet, and I was already emotionally invested in that wagyu. I went back to the table. Luca looked up when I sat down with the exact expression of someone who could tell I'd been having a crisis, and found it informative. "You looked me up," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did," I confirmed. And I want you to know," I said with enormous dignity, "that my opinion of the suit remains unchanged." He stared at me. "You're not afraid of me," he said slowly, like he was narrating a nature documentary about an animal he'd never encountered before. "I'm a little afraid of you," I said honestly. But the suit thing was already out there, so I figured we were past the point of me being diplomatic. He leaned forward very slightly. Most people, upon discovering what I do, become very agreeable. "I bet that gets boring." The fault line shifted again. The almost smile almost appeared. "Extremely," he said quietly. And then the wagyu arrived, and I made a sound that I will not describe in this story because it's embarrassing, and Luca Vitale, feared patriarch of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, watched me experience a steak with the focused, puzzled attention of a man encountering something he didn't have a category for. I didn't know it then, but that was the exact moment I became a problem for him. I didn't expect to hear from him again. This was logical. I had insulted him, mildly panicked in his bathroom, and eaten the wagyu with what he later described as alarming enthusiasm. I had also, when he'd offered to have his driver take me home, said that's okay, the bus builds character. Which in retrospect, was not something people said to Luca Vitale, and which had caused the driver to stare at me like I'd announced I was going to walk to the moon. I was home by 10, in my pajamas by 10:03, and being judged by Gerald, my enormous, gray, magnificently unpleasant cat, by 10:04. It was fine, I told him. He was interesting. Gerald blinked at me with the slow, withering blink he reserves for statements he finds beneath comment. He had nice eyes, I added. Gerald turned around and showed me his back. I know, I said. The suit was a lot. At 11:15 my phone buzzed. I looked up your work. The Harman & Cole rebrand was yours. I stared at the unknown number. Then I stared at the ceiling. Then I typed back. How do you have this number? I have most numbers. That's alarming. The rebrand was exceptional. I sat up straighter. The Harman & Cole rebrand was my best work. 18 months of my life, a color system I was still privately proud of, typography I'd agonized over for weeks. Very few people outside the industry knew it was mine. You know design? I typed. I know quality. Your suit didn't know quality. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I'm having it burned. I laughed so suddenly that Gerald startled off the bed. It was a real laugh. The kind that comes out before you can decide whether it's appropriate. That seems extreme, I typed. Donate it. Some very confident man at a New Year's party would love it. I'll take it under advisement. Good night, Casey. I looked at the message for a long time. Gerald, I said to the cat, who had returned to the foot of the bed and was now staring at my phone with profound suspicion. This is going to be a problem, isn't it? Gerald put his paw directly on top of my phone. He was, as always, completely right. He actually called with his voice like a person from the 1950s, 3 days later, and asked if I was free for lunch. I have a lunch break at 1, I said, but I only get 45 minutes and my office is on the... I know where your office is. That's still alarming. So is taking the bus when someone offered you a driver? 1 o'clock. The restaurant he chose was a beautiful, intimate Italian place 2 blocks from my office that I had walked past approximately 400 times, and never been able to get a reservation at. When I arrived, there were no other diners. Just crisp white tablecloths, soft music, a waiter who appeared to have been waiting specifically for me, and Luca, in a navy suit, much better, standing as I walked in. Did you rent out this restaurant? I asked. I own it, he said simply. Of course you do. I sat down. The navy is an improvement, by the way. Massive improvement. I have 3 witnesses who will confirm I did not dress with your approval in mind. Those witnesses work for you, so they're biased. Something in his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. He had a way of looking at me that was different from how I imagined he looked at most people. Less like an assessment, more like something that baffled him in a way he had apparently decided to lean into rather than resolve. Lunch was 45 minutes. We talked about my work. Genuinely talked. He asked questions that proved he'd actually looked at my portfolio, which was disorienting and flattering in equal measure. I asked questions about his work and he said, with complete composure, I manage several enterprises, and I said, that's a very tidy way to put it. And he said, I thought you'd appreciate the understatement, and I laughed again, that same surprised laugh. At 1:46, his driver pulled up to take me back to my office. You didn't have to do all this, I said at the door. I know, he said. The restaurant, I'm aware. Then why? He looked at me with those dark, assessing eyes, and said very quietly, you told me my suit was ugly, Casey. To my face. Without hesitation. He paused. I haven't stopped thinking about it. I did not know what to say to that. It was very ugly, I offered. Inexcusably, he agreed. And he put me in the car, and I went back to work, and I sat at my desk for the rest of the afternoon doing absolutely no graphic design whatsoever. I found out later, much later, that Luca's inner circle had been in a state of low-grade alarm since the night of our first date. Marco, his underboss and apparent best friend since childhood, had apparently pulled up my social media the morning after the dinner, scrolled for approximately 3 minutes and reported back with, "She has a cat named Gerald. She called a client's logo spiritually beige. She describes her personal style as business raccoon. Luca, she's unhinged." To which Luca had apparently said nothing, which Marco recognized as worse than anything he could have said. I met Marco at what I was told was a casual dinner, at Luca's townhouse, which was the least casual space I had ever been inside. All dark wood, expensive art, and the general atmosphere of a place that took itself very seriously. Marco was broad tattooed, and looked at me like I was a grenade someone had left on the kitchen counter. "So you're the one," he said. "The one what?" I asked. "The one who told him." He glanced at Luca, who was in the kitchen and technically out of earshot, and lowered his voice. "About the suit." "Oh." I nodded. "Yes." "It was the Brioni, yeah? The gold. Was that what it was called?" $12,000 suit. I absorbed this. It was $12,000? Handmade. "Marco," I said seriously, "someone robbed him." Marco stared at me for one full second, then made a sound like a man trying to hold back a dam. "I've been saying that for years," he said. "Do you know how many times He stopped, visibly collected himself, and pointed at me with renewed suspicion. "He likes you. I want to be clear that this concerns me professionally." "Because I'm a distraction? Because you're not afraid of him?" "I'm a little afraid." People who are a little afraid of Luca don't tell him his suit is ugly. He shook his head. "They compliment the suit. They compliment the watch. They ask where he got the suit. That sounds exhausting for everyone involved." Marco opened his mouth, closed it, looked at me with the expression of a man having his entire threat assessment recalibrated in real time. "You're going to be a problem," he said finally. "Your boss said the same thing. I think you mean it differently." He squinted. "You know, I think he likes you because you don't know what you're doing." "What am I doing?" "Exactly," he said, and went to get more wine. Looking back, I can identify at least 3 separate occasions, during the month of us whatever we were doing, when I was almost certainly in danger and simply did not register it. Incident 1. A black SUV followed us for 6 blocks after a Sunday walk in the park. I noticed it and said, "That car is being very intense about this street." Luca made a single phone call in Italian. The car turned off at the next light. I assumed it was a coincidence and continued telling him about the time Gerald knocked my laptop off the table during a client presentation. Incident 2. A man at a coffee shop I liked kept appearing at the next table over several visits in a row. I thought he was a regular. I waved at him once. He looked like he might pass out. He was gone the following week. I assumed he'd found a new coffee shop. Incident 3. Someone sent flowers to my apartment with no card. I assumed it was a misdirected delivery, and put them in a vase because they were nice. Later I would learn this was a warning from a rival that Luca had resolved with a composure I did not want to know more details about. I sent him a text that week saying someone accidentally sent me flowers. Very pretty, kind of weird. He responded, "Glad you enjoyed them. Dinner Thursday?" I said yes. I am very perceptive. It happened on a Wednesday, which is notable because I've said nothing good happens to me on Tuesdays. And Wednesdays have historically been marginal. We were at his townhouse. I'd come to return a jacket I'd borrowed 3 weeks earlier after an unexpected rainstorm. A jacket that was worth more than my rent, and that I had transported to and from his home in a garment bag like a piece of evidence. We'd ended up talking for 4 hours without noticing, which was something that kept happening with him. And it was late, and he was walking me toward the door, and there was a moment, a very specific, very clear moment, in the hallway, where the lamplight was doing something nice and we'd run out of things to say and were just looking at each other. He reached up and pushed a piece of hair out of my face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with every other thing I knew about him. And I thought, oh, this is happening. And he leaned forward slightly and I leaned forward slightly and his phone rang. Not a normal ringtone. A specific tone, the kind that apparently meant everything is on fire, immediately. He went very still. Then he stepped back, and the look on his face cycled through several things very quickly. Irritation, resolve, something I didn't have a word for, before settling into the professional mask he wore when he was about to deal with something that required him to be the most feared man in the room. "I have to go," I said. My voice was impressively level. I was very proud of it. "Casey." "Luca." I picked up my bag. "I have lived 30 seconds in a hallway. They'll survive in my memory. Go do your." I gestured vaguely. Empire things. He looked at me for a moment, that long, precise look, and said very quietly, I'll make it up to you. You can start by replacing that phone with one that has a worse ringtone, I said, and let myself out. I sat in the back of his car for 20 minutes before I remembered I'd told the driver I didn't need a ride and had to get the bus. The bus stop smelled like old ambition. I didn't even care. It took Gerald 4 months to accept Luca Vitale into our home. This is relevant because Gerald does not accept anyone. He has not accepted my mother in 11 years. He looks at the mailman with the specific contempt of someone who has filed a formal complaint and is awaiting resolution. He once stared at a houseplant for 6 hours with an energy that suggested he believed it had made a personal choice to be in his space. The turning point came on a Sunday morning when Luca arrived with coffee. He'd learned my order within the first 2 weeks and had never once asked for confirmation. He simply remembered things, which was either very romantic or very on brand for a man with an intelligence network, and sat on my sofa, and Gerald stalked over to perform his customary threat assessment. Luca looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Luca. Luca reached out one hand very still and waited. This is not what people do. People make sounds at Gerald. They reach too fast. They try to pet before invited. Gerald has scratched better people than all of them. Luca simply waited, with the patience of a man who understood that power sometimes meant stillness. Gerald sniffed his hand, walked in a circle, sat down directly on Luca's shoe. That was it. That was the acceptance. He likes you, I said, stunned. Animals generally don't, Luca said, looking down at Gerald with something I can only describe as cautious respect. He's the first. He's a good judge of character, I said. That is either very reassuring or deeply threatening, he said. With Gerald it's both. Gerald began to purr. Luca looked up at me. And this time the almost smile actually arrived. Not a full smile, not yet, but real and warm, and entirely human in a way that rearranged something in my chest. Casey, he said. Yes. I need to tell you some things. About what I do. About what this, he gestured between us, would mean. I sat down across from him. Gerald relocated to his lap, because apparently that was where we were now. I figured, I said. I've had a few months to come to terms with the Wikipedia situation. There's a Wikipedia page? There's a section. He closed his eyes briefly. I'll have it removed. Please don't. It's very dramatic and I've read it 4 times. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I looked back and neither of us said anything for a moment. I'm not simple, he said finally. What I do is not. I want you to understand what you'd be. Luca. I said it gently but clearly. I told you your suit was ugly on the first night. I asked if you'd been robbed when I found out what it cost. I've waved at your surveillance and accidentally befriended your underboss. I think we've established that I'm not approaching this with a normal threat assessment. That's what worries me, he said. But his hand had moved to rest over mine, and Gerald was purring like a broken radiator. And the morning light was coming through the window of my very modest apartment onto the most unexpectedly complicated man I'd ever met. Tell me everything, I said. He did. It took 2 hours and 3 cups of coffee and I had several feelings and asked several questions that made him look at me like I was a species he couldn't classify. But when it was over, when he told me the real shape of his life with a directness I hadn't expected, I just sat with it for a while. Okay, I said. Okay. I'm not saying I don't have notes, I said. I have many notes. We will need to have many conversations. But okay. I looked at him. You're still a person. You're the person who waited for my cat to come to you instead of grabbing for him. That's not nothing. He looked at our hands. No, he said quietly. It's not. 6 months in, I came home to find a large, flat box on my kitchen table with a card that said, in Luca's handwriting, don't say anything until you open it. Inside, folded in tissue paper, was the gold suit. Not a new gold suit. The gold suit. The Brioni. The chandelier funeral original. Attached was a second note. Framed was Marco's suggestion. He said it belongs in a museum. I said it belongs with the only person who ever looked at it and said exactly what they thought. Elle. I stood in my kitchen holding $12,000 worth of the ugliest suit I had ever seen and laughed until I had to sit on the floor. Gerald came to investigate and sat on the tissue paper. That evening, Luca arrived for dinner. We'd gotten into the habit of cooking together, which was chaotic because I cook by feeling and he cooks by precise measurement, and we've agreed this is a metaphor we will not pursue. And found me standing back and appraising the suit, which I had, in fact, hung on the wall above the sofa in a second-hand frame. He stopped in the doorway. "You actually hung it," he said. "I actually hung it. I genuinely cannot tell if that's an insult." "It's a monument," I said, "to the worst first impression that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." I paused. "Or second best. Gerald was first." He crossed the room, and this time there was no phone call, no driver, no hallway interruption, just him, tilting my chin up with one hand in the way that still, 6 months later, made my brain briefly lose signal, and saying very quietly, "Whoever told me that suit was ugly changed my life." "She sounds extremely perceptive," I said. "She's the only person who's ever been honest with me without wanting something in return." I thought about that. She wanted the wagyu. She got the wagyu. Then it was a fair exchange. He kissed me, finally, properly, without interruption, and the ugly gold suit watched from the wall, and Gerald made a sound of profound approval from the sofa. And somewhere in the city, Marco was telling this story to anyone who would listen, framing it as a cautionary tale that he privately considered the best thing that had ever happened to his boss. He was right. We were all right in the end. Epilogue 1 year later. The suit now has a placard. Luca installed it himself, on a Sunday morning, while I made coffee and pretended not to watch. It says in small engraved letters, Brioni 2019. First worn on a first date. Retired at the request of the only person who ever told the truth. We argued about the wording for 40 minutes. I thought it should say chandelier funeral aesthetic. He thought that was undignified. I pointed out that dignity had not historically been the suit's strong suit. He threatened to have it moved to storage. I threatened to call Marco. We compromised on the placard. Marco, at our 1-year dinner, made a toast that was ostensibly about love and commitment, and that was actually mostly about the suit, and how the fact that the most feared man he'd ever known had framed a jacket because a woman with paint on her dress and a cat named Gerald had told him the truth was, and I quote, statistically the least Vitale thing that has ever happened, and I respect it enormously. Gerald sat in Luca's lap for the duration of the dinner. The bus stop near my apartment still smells like old ambition. I know because I walked past it last week with Luca, on our way to the Italian restaurant he owns, where we go on Sundays now, and where the staff no longer closes early but simply sets a table in the corner, and puts out the wine, and acts like two people arguing cheerfully about typography and criminal enterprises are a perfectly normal thing to witness. They've stopped being alarmed. Most people do, eventually. I never told Luca he wasn't what I expected. It seemed redundant. But sometimes, in the morning, when he's reading something at my kitchen table and Gerald is on his feet, and the light is coming through the window at the angle that makes everything look like it's been color graded for a romantic comedy, I think about the Tuesday I answered that phone call. About the wagyu I came for, and the man I found. About the suit on my wall, and the almost smiles that became real ones, and the way fear and honesty and one absolutely catastrophic piece of tailoring can, apparently, be the beginning of something extraordinarily good. I still think the suit is ugly. I will take this to my grave. The end. Thanks for spending time with Flustered Novel. If this story made you laugh, blush, or scream at the characters, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and come back for more chaotic romance stories. See you in the next novel. The only opinion he ever asked for was the one no one else would give him. She gave it about a suit. He stayed for the rest.